if you don't have early stage biotech companies now, you won't have mid-stage biotech companies 2-3 years from now. Because if all early stage companies die or very few make it, your opportunities for having late stage companies later will just be that much lower. It's a real pipeline problem.
Well, Cuong, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I've so been looking forward to this.
Brandon, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on.
For the audience, Cuong has had a incredible career, 17 years at McKinsey as a senior partner, and then dabbled across consumer electronics at Lenovo and Samsung, as well as pharma at Merck before starting a series of biotechs. But Cuong, would love to hear from you. Maybe just give us a thumbnail sketch of your career and how we tied the story points together here.
Sure. Actually, I was born in Vietnam. My family emigrated to the US at the end of the war. We arrived when I was 9 years old with $20 to our name to change of clothes. I did not speak English then, so that was really the first priority. And when you have nothing, the best way to learn English is to watch as much TV as you can and read anything you can get your hands on. And this was the mid-70s, which was the advent of modern immunology as we know it. So somehow I came across this topic, got really hooked on it, started asking all kinds of questions, drove my parents crazy. But because they never went to college, couldn't answer the questions. But my mom did work down the street from the medical school. So she just took it upon herself to take me around to see anybody that was willing to take some time to talk to me. And somewhere along the way, there was a professor that was intrigued that this little kid was asking these kinds of questions. So he just took me under his wing. So I started doing medical research when I was 14 years old.
Wow.
But I eventually went on to Dartmouth, got a double major in biochemistry and economics, got an MBA all in 5 years because I was in a hurry. I had accepted a slot at Stanford Medical School to finish my training there. But while in business school, I realized I loved the knowledge of medicine, but not necessarily the practice of the research of it. And McKinsey, a large consulting firm, was really building a new healthcare practice at the time. So I ended up going to McKinsey, where I stayed for 17 years and ended up helping build the healthcare, the high tech, and the corporate finance practices with the firm. So my professional work has really been around healthcare and high tech. High tech because I spent 7 years in Korea. And that's, as you know, the land of high-tech products and so forth. So I had some clients in that particular. Samsung was my client in that area. And that's why I spent a lot of time there. I eventually left McKinsey as I was turning 40. Right? And despite then, after 17 years, I was a senior partner at the firm, but I didn't want to run anything there. So I knew I had to go and do something different. So since then, I've been a serial chief strategy officer for large companies, starting first with Lenovo as part of the team that integrated the IBM acquisition, and then at Tyco Electronics as part of the team that created Tyco Electronics when Tyco demerged into 3 companies, and then Merck. And as I was leaving Merck, my friends at Samsung made the push to get me to Samsung. All these years, I kept saying no because I did not want to move back to Korea. But at this time, my good friend just needed a lot of help. My good friend's the son, who at the time was going to become the next chairman of the group. He needed a lot of help, and I will always help a friend. So I then spent 7 years essentially commuting back and forth between New Jersey and Seoul every other week to lead the global strategy group for Samsung. Right. And along the way, I've also started 3 companies with my brother. Our first company, we discovered a drug for Pompe disease. We sold that to Amicus Therapeutics. We had a very nice exit there, and we've reinvested that in the companies that we founded since. And that along the way, I've also actively invested in biotech startup and serve on their boards. And that's how I got to BioVie. I put in some early money into the company. I was on the board, and I helped orchestrate the acquisition that brings us our CNS asset. And at that point in time, the board asked me to step in to help lead the development of the portfolio. And that's why you and I are talking right now. It's just because I saw value and potential in this molecule, and I pushed for the acquisition.
Absolutely. And we'll get to BioVie in just a second, but I'm too curious to ask, or too curious not to ask, rather. What has it been like spanning the worlds of, management consulting, high-tech consumer electronics, and pharma? What has been the similar through line that has allowed you to be successful across these kinds of domains? And maybe what has been different that has forced you to adapt?
Well, frankly, for me, it's all about leadership, right? And when you're in leadership position, there are certain skills you develop that's applicable regardless of what business you're in. I just happen to like healthcare and I like high tech, but my role, frankly, is first I recognize uh, I am not the smartest person around, right, on any particular topic. Therefore, I surround myself with people who are smarter than I am, who are better than I am on the various topics that are needed. And my role is to provide air cover and, frankly, get out of the way and let them be successful in what they do, right? So the first role of a senior leader is make sure you build a great team. Because if you have a great team of A players and you make them successful, that's how the company succeeds. And that is a tenet I've always carried with me, regardless of whether it's high tech, consumer electronics, or healthcare, pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. So then let's kind of jump in a little bit onto the biotech side. What has it been like founding and investing in a series of biotechs up until this point?
It's hard work, right? And the thing I've learned is that with all startups, and especially biotech startup, it takes twice as much money and three times as long to get anything done as you think it does, because it's science. Science does not always work out the first time. It doesn't work out the way that you expected. And there's always going to be unexpected surprises, some good as well, right? Many are not good in that it just takes longer, but some are just very pleasant surprises that just kind of leads you to new things, right? So you become an entrepreneur, um, not because you think this is going to be some prescribed thing. You become an entrepreneur. I became an entrepreneur because I wanted to make a difference, right? I wanted to make a difference. Diseases that we work on, the things that I focus on are things that just are not, there are no solutions right now. And somebody needs to go and put in place those solutions. And when you're discovering and new things, you're trying to chart new paths, it always is going to be more difficult than you think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the themes that kind of comes up on this show often with some of the other CEOs we speak with is that if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth doing, and it certainly wouldn't be an opportunity in biotech
Yeah.
at this point.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I went to Dartmouth College, and one of the legendary presidents of Dartmouth had a saying, um, make the world's troubles your troubles, right? And because there's nothing so great out there that great minds, great men and women cannot go and solve. Right? And the world is full of big troubles, big problems. Go and solve them, right? Versus just kind of go and repeat and do what has already been chartered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that takes us to BioVie. I'd love to hear what kind of gave you confidence to be an early investor, and then taking the leap from being an early investor to taking the kind of helm as the CEO. I'm sure has been a sequence of escalating conviction.
Sure. Um, BioVie started as essentially in liver disease. Right? And the company was started by a business school classmate, right? So someone I knew, someone I trusted, and so forth. And he came asking for help. And I will always, like I said, I will always help a friend. So I put in some early money into the company because I believe that the company's um, product could become the first product to essentially solve a condition called ascites, which is end stage liver disease, right? And our product, BIV 201, we know that it's efficacious because it's been available outside the US for decades, but it's never been approved in the US because it has a horrible safety profile. The way that we reformulated that product, um, and the way that we changed the way it's administered. So we take the same amount of drug that needs to be delivered and we put it through a continuous infusion pump. So we slowly drip it into the patient over the course of a day. And by doing so, we've been able to show that we can avoid the safety problems. Right? And that's really where the company started. And ascites is a condition that affects 20,000 new patients each year in the United States alone. And these patients have a 50+% mortality rate within a year.
Wow.
And there are no treatments for ascites right now. And we're hoping to have the first treatment for ascites. That's solving a real big unmet problem.
Incredible. And tell me about the transition in the pipeline to CNS.
Um, Frankly, it is, believe it or not, both CNS conditions and ascites and liver disease have inflammation as a commonality. Right? So that's where we just kind of saw commonality. But the other thing too is just it's opportunistic. It truly is opportunistic. There was a great asset available to be had, and that asset needed help and needed leadership and it needed cash to move it forward, and we just took advantage of it, and that's why I championed the acquisition of the asset and essentially put up the company behind it, right, to really move it forward because we believe this particular asset, the drug candidate bezisterim, could become the first truly effective drug for Alzheimer's. We could become the first new therapy for Parkinson's in over 5 decades, and hopefully could become the first therapy for patients suffering from long COVID, right? And it all has to do with inflammation.
Yeah, I want to dig into the inflammation kind of root cause in just a minute, but let's imagine one day I'm a biotech CEO and I'm evaluating assets. What does it take to do great diligence here and get the conviction on bringing something new into the portfolio?
Well, it really starts with your scientific diligence, right? You really have to go and do your homework on the science and whether this drug, this mechanism of action has the potential to work. There is absolutely no guarantees out there, right? If you're trying to do something new, there's absolutely no guarantees. And so what we are doing is that we are taking an educated guess that this thing could work. And this is what we do in science. This is what we do in pharmaceuticals all the time. I'll give you an example. When I was at Merck, we had a program in Alzheimer's called a BACE inhibitor program. And that clinical trial was going to cost us $1 billion. And we knew going in that this probably has about a 25 to 30% probability of success. But it's a theory, it's a hypothesis that needed to be tested. And we were the only company that could go and do it because we have the only molecule that has ever been created to be able to go and interact with and inhibit BACE. So we went for that program. That program, of course, did not work. That clinical trial failed. If I were value maximizing, I could have taken that $1 billion, went to Vegas, and would have been a better return than essentially putting it behind that clinical trial. But this is what we have to do in science. You have to go and chart the uncharted, right? And go and test every plausible hypothesis. So you have to figure out what is the plausible hypothesis here. You have to figure out whether or not this asset has a chance of working. And then depending on your conviction, you pursue it.
Oh, come on, Cuong. I'm sure that Vegas has a lower expected value than that trial. Okay. I'm glad you're going to this kind of plausible hypothesis. Tell me more about the plausible hypothesis that kind of connects Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and frankly, long COVID, which feels maybe a little bit further abreast.
Yeah. Well, we believe that inflammation is the root cause of many bad things that start to happen in the body, right? But it's a fine window. First of all, inflammation is part of the body's natural defense mechanisms, right? So when we get an infection, for example, or immune cells kick in to try to fight off that infection. But as the immune cells work, they release TNF alpha, for example, and that is inflammatory. It causes inflammation. But when the infection has been worn off, the immune cells just going to go back to normal states, and then the inflammation disappear, right? The inflammation is there for a reason. When it's no longer needed, it just goes away. The problem now is when we constantly expose the body to essentially different infarcts, right? When our diet's poor, we put ourselves in situations where there are toxins and so forth. The body is constantly trying to fight something off, which then creates a state of low-grade chronic inflammation where TNF alpha is around all the time. And when you have TNF alpha, you kick off a lot of downstream consequences that goes along with that. TNF alpha essentially initiates a series of processes that leads to insulin resistance. Right? TNF alpha essentially creates more inflammation, and it actually creates more APP, or the amyloid precursor protein, which then leads to more amyloid, which has been implicated in Alzheimer's, right? And there are a number of other reasons that is associated with Alzheimer's. Um, I mentioned insulin resistance. Two things needs to be true for a person to develop Parkinson's symptoms. Right. One is you need low dopamine levels in the brain, and then the second is you need inflammation and the associated insulin resistance. If you can reverse the insulin resistance in the brain, the body is then able to use the available dopamine there to help restore muscle control. Right. And so that's how inflammation is tied to Parkinson's as well, as through its ability to essentially through insulin resistance. And then long COVID, in the last couple of years, researchers have tied the symptoms of long COVID to inflammation that works through exactly the same mechanisms where bezisterim affects, essentially through TNF alpha. Right? And that's one example of how inflammation, one factor, TNF alpha, affects three completely seemingly different diseases, right? That is all related because of TNF alpha and the processes that it kicks off.
That's fascinating. As you think about these three potential applications of this asset, how do you even decide what to go after first? I imagine that as a biotech, you have to make limited bets with the resources available. How do you even think about that?
Well, you have to prioritize based upon the resources you have at the time and based upon the data you have at the time. Right? Initially, we prioritized Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, right? And now we have to put our Alzheimer's trial on hold while we essentially try to raise additional funds. So right now, our priority is Parkinson's and long COVID. These are the priorities partly because scientifically, they are relatively easy to prove or disprove.
Sure.
Right? And it could be done in a relatively short period of time. And as a result, they are affordable given our company's resources at this point in time. Right. So we just have to prioritize that way. And then we will come back to Alzheimer's when we have additional resources and we will restart those phase 3 trials.
What makes Parkinson's more cost effective to do research in than Alzheimer's?
First of all, it's something that you can more easily measure. Can you have muscle control? It's more objective in that manner, right? So those are things that you can count. Those are things you can observe. The second is that it can be observed in a relatively short period of time. In the trial that we're conducting right now that we've just initiated, it's just 3 months, right? So we're seeing what could happen to muscle control over the course of 3 months, right? Versus in Alzheimer's, it's at least 6 months. And many of these trials go on for 18 months, right? So it's a long time. So those are things that we have to consider.
Yeah. What have you learned about designing great trials in kind of your career across big pharma and biotechs?
Great trials, first and foremost, are testing a hypothesis or have endpoints that can be observed, hopefully very objectively, with quantifiable metrics. Right? That's the number one criteria. Some diseases are very, very difficult to do, right? Alzheimer's actually is quite difficult to do because the metric is cognition, right? And if you wake up this morning with a headache or something, your cognition is going to be impaired compared to what it would be otherwise, right? So variability is the endpoint is tricky, right? And then the second thing to make a great trial is you try to minimize variability through everything possible. So this is where your inclusion and exclusion criteria for a trial are critical. So these are the parameters that you set that says only patients that have disease symptoms or other biomarkers and other things that fall within these boundaries, have had the disease for so long and so forth, are eligible to be in the trial because you're trying to make the comparison, the trial as homogeneous as possible. You don't want like apples and oranges, right? You want all apples. Those are the real hallmark. And then, of course, execution, right? You've got to have the right people out there executing your trial. You have to stay very, very tight to the sites and the patients and so forth. Right?
Yeah,
Execution.
absolutely. Yeah, we've spoken with some of the folks across, Ray Sanchez, who was this CMO over at Cerevel, and Stephen Brennan, who was the CMO over at Karuna, on kind of like both schizophrenia programs. And one thing that's a common theme that we hear a lot is that the variance, especially with subjective endpoints, specifically in psychiatry, but also in Alzheimer's, can make things particularly difficult.
Yeah, it kills trials, right? So you need to have the experience to be able to design those trials. And luckily, our chief medical officer used to run psychiatry for J&J, right? And he got the first drug for ALS approved and so forth. So we have long track record working in CNS and being able to do those kinds of trials.
Yeah, fascinating. They kind of the Spravato story is a story that we've highlighted on this show along the way, and just kind of seeing how J&J invested and built up the CNS programs has been remarkable. How are you thinking about long COVID? I think I saw online that in doing the research that partially funded with the DoD. Like, how are you thinking about this?
Well, first of all, there are 20 million Americans who currently have or have had long COVID. And there are no treatments for long COVID out there. And currently, roughly 3 million Americans have had to change their jobs or stop working simply because they cannot keep up with the demands of work due to the debilitating symptoms of brain fog, extreme fatigue, and malaise that goes along with this. And as I mentioned before, researchers believe that these symptoms are caused by inflammation. So while the body may have fought off the actual infection, parts of the protein, like the spike proteins and other part of the virus, could still be circulating around. It's not causing infection, but it's creating the impetus for the body to be constantly fighting something, right? So that's what causes the chronic inflammation. And as I mentioned before, our drug just blocks the production of TNF alpha at just the right place and right time. And we're the only drug out there that we know of that's able to do this in this particular manner, and particularly in the brain as well. And that's why we've been given this grant. We're the only company that's been given a grant to test the therapeutic in long COVID, right? And that's why we're very much looking forward to this. We hope to be announcing that, or the first patient would be dose would be randomized in this trial within the next week or two, right? So this trial we've been working really hard to get it started. It is starting now. We hope to announce that it's fully underway very, very soon.
Well, hopefully by the time this podcast airs, you will be well underway on the program.
Yes, I hope so too.
Hey, you mentioned the kind of access to the brain. My understanding is that bezisterim is a small molecule that crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is like a pretty big distinction with some of the anti-amyloid antibodies that are large molecule approaches.
Oh, it's a game changer, right? And that's part of the reason why I really liked the molecule from the time I saw it. It freely crosses into the CNS. The ratio of what's available in the CNS compared to what's available in blood is almost 1-to-1, right? And because this is a small molecule, it's able to cross very easily, which makes it very different from the anti-amyloid antibody that you referred to. First of all, these drugs are antibodies, so they're large molecules, right? And when they cross the blood-brain barrier, they're crossing blood vessels, right? And crossing from the blood vessels into the brain is one thing, right? So that is in and of itself difficult. But then it binds onto amyloid, right? Which then makes this whole thing even bigger, right? And then when you're trying to essentially bring it back to the bloodstream, that's where it causes a lot of concerns around brain swelling and brain bleeding, right? And that's why patients taking these that are on the anti-amyloid antibodies are constantly having to be monitored by PET scans just due to the severe concerns about brain swelling and brain bleeding, all because of this crossing back and forth between the blood vessels and the CNS.
There's been a little bit of, let's call it, turbulence around amyloid, the amyloid hypotheses, amyloid plaque. Why do you think the kind of amyloid plaque theory was dominant for so long relative to inflammation and some of these other approaches?
Well, yeah, when I first started working in Alzheimer's back in the late 80s, right, amyloid was really, um, everybody focused on amyloid. Right? And I think if you go back to the NIH back in those days and really talk to people who were around, they would tell you there were a number of competing hypotheses as to what was really going on. Inflammation was known back then too, right? A lot of people understood that there was an inflammatory component to Alzheimer's, but back then there was really nothing that could be done, right? And also remember back then there was also very limited funding available as well. And so when you have limited funding, you basically pick a horse, right, to ride. And I think that's how the whole amyloid focus came about. But then, of course, over time, it became a monster, if you will, right? In fact, over time, even to this day, it's practically impossible to get an NIH grant in Alzheimer's if you don't talk about or refer to amyloid or tau in one way or another. We've applied for grants from the NIH, and we constantly get asked the question, now, how does this affect amyloid and how does this affect tau? Right? Or it's a tertiary effect, right? We block inflammation first and foremost, and we believe that actually drives many of the things, the Alzheimer's pathology. But if you want to get a grant at the NIH in Alzheimer's, you got to focus on amyloid, and that's how it became such a monster, right? It just kind of steamrolled everything.
In hindsight, do you think this was like a blind spot scientifically, or more of kind of like a system failure?
Well, I'm not there, so I can't really say. But I think that the reality is, I believe the field mistook correlation with causation. Right? There was a strong correlation that when you have Alzheimer's, you just also have elevated amyloid, right? And the hypothesis was that was what's causing it. So the hypothesis, if you remove amyloid, you should be able to improve cognition, right? And that has not borne out, right? I think over the course of the last decade or so, more and more researchers have come around to the point of view that amyloid plaques and tau tangles are not the toxic agents themselves that's causing neurodegeneration, but what they are doing is they're causing inflammation. But many other factors cause inflammation as well. But they all have one thing in common. They all activate ERK and NF-kappa B to lead to the production of TNF-alpha. And that just happens to be the sweet spot of where our drug candidate works. And let me be also very candid. We did not set out to do this. We just got really lucky. Right? We just had our eyes open to, because once we understood where the drug works, we then just very quickly shifted from insulin resistance, from diabetes, which is where the drug was originally brought into the clinic to do, over to the CNS aspects of what we're trying to do.
I imagine that takes a fair amount of like intellectual flexibility in order to make this kind of pivot. What is that like, having an asset that you kind of bring in under one indication or one therapeutic area even, and then realizing mid-flight that there might be other applications that are worth kind of pursuing instead?
Oh, please do not give us more credit than we deserve. The team that we purchased this from made that connection, right? So that was the team that originally brought the drug into the clinic for diabetes. And in that diabetes trial, they saw exactly what they were hoping to see: a reversed insulin resistance. It brought HbA1c, glucose, and a bunch of other biological systems back into normal ranges. But that was before they understood the mechanism of action.
Huh.
After they understood the mechanism of action, that team, right, those two guys are still with us. We consider them to be the godfathers, Bezzy Sturm. Once they understood the mechanism of action, they saw very clearly that this is a very unique role of molecule that plays a much, much larger role in CNS than it does in diabetes. Part of the uniqueness is what we talked about earlier, that it crosses into the blood-brain barrier, right? There is a sister molecule that we have on the shelf right now that does not cross into the blood-brain barrier. That one day when we have the resources, I'd like to go and dust that off and develop it for something that doesn't need to go into this across the CNS. Perhaps it's a diabetes drug or it's an anti-inflammation, an anti-TNF drug, right? Because right now, drugs like Humira, Solaris, and so forth, those anti-TNF antibodies still play a very critical role in diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's, and so forth. But if you ask the patients, they'll tell you there are still limitations to those drugs. It's not as convenient as taking a pill. And I think people would rather take a pill.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'd love to maybe just like shift gears towards is the current state of financing. I know that biotechs have had a rough go of it, and we've spoken a lot about the need to raise capital, prioritize new programs in order to kind of pursue the interesting science that you have ahead of you. How do you think about raising capital in this kind of environment, and what do you think other biotech CEOs are kind of thinking about today?
This is the worst biotech funding capital market I've seen in my career. Right, there has just been nothing like this. And I think what ultimately happened is that during the early days of COVID, there was just biotech euphoria where lots of companies who got funded that should never have gotten funded, right? The scientific thesis, the scientific hypothesis that were being put there was just not fully tested before they were funded. And consequently, many of those programs died, right? So many of the VCs that funded them are just really in trouble, right? And last year, if you look at capital calls compared to capital's return to shareholders, to investors, the capital calls far, far outweighed the cash that was being returned. So as a result, the investors, the LPs, were not living up to their capital calls. They were just calling it quits. So VCs really didn't have more capital to deploy. It then became much, much more conservative and in making new investments. It's so bad right now out there that unless you have a phase 2 clinical asset, people won't even talk to you. Right? You get some of the greatest science around, but even if it's not in the clinic with phase 2 data, it's very difficult to get funded. Right? So lots of biotech companies are hurting. We happen to be in the clinic. We happen to be at phase 2, phase 3. We're finding it difficult. It's very difficult. It's not impossible. The conditions are very, very difficult out there. Right? And all the chaos in the market since February of this year just basically leads all investors right now are just sitting on the sideline. Not all, virtually all investors are just sitting on the sidelines. So as I talk to banks and investors, they're basically saying, I'm just going to wait it out. I'm hoping things will clear up by the summer and we'll come back to look in the summer.
What's your outlook here? Are we bottoming right now? Is this a falling knife? How are folks thinking about this? How are you feeling about it?
If I knew the answer to that,
Maybe I'd be making other bets.
Exactly. It's just my bankers tell me various stories, and I just don't think anybody really has an answer to that.
Everybody has a narrative, but they're probably talking their book.
Everybody has an opinion. I think it's just I just don't think everybody has a crystal ball.
That's fair. Do you think that I mean, if we take maybe like a slightly longer term horizon, maybe that's a little bit easier to kind of opine on. Do we think that the outlook for new phase 2, phase 3 studies, like in the next 3 or 4 years, are going to be challenged, given just how hard it is to translate into the clinic right now with funding? Or does that bounce back pretty fast?
Here's the reality: is that if you don't have early stage biotech companies now, you won't have mid stage biotech companies 2-3 years from now. It's just a reality, right? Because if all early stage companies die or very few make it, your opportunities for having late stage companies later will just be that much lower.
It's a pipeline problem.
It's a real pipeline problem. It's a real domino effect. That's correct. And I think there are a couple of companies, big pharma companies, that are beginning to see that. So that's why you see these specialized early stage VC funds that have been seeded out there to try to address some of this, but it's just not enough, right? So I think more is needed. I hope this spigot will start to open up a little bit more over the course of the year, because otherwise we as an industry are going to, and society will be hurting a few years from now.
It really is a tale of two cities, right? Because on one hand, in the early mid phase, things are a little bit squeezed. On the other hand, you've got the Eli Lillys of the world who almost have too much kind of cash being generated than they know how to deploy effectively right now.
Yeah. So if you look at Novo Ventures, they're one of the few venture funds out there, and they're just actively investing, right? It is Realty City. If you have lots of cash, this is the time to invest. Heck, if I had $1 billion, right, I would be out there investing in a lot of things, because I think that $1 billion would be many multiples of that in 2-3 years.
Yeah, you sound like a San Francisco real estate investor right now.
Well, it's valuations are way down, right? Valuations are way down.
Maybe to kind of wrap here, I'd love to just think a little bit more about the future. Which emerging technologies, modalities are you most excited about? Or are you most closely watching?
There's a lot of stuff that people are trying now to do to essentially cross the blood-brain barrier, right? BBB crossing, I think, is finally getting to a point where we can more predictably get it done, right? So I'm pretty excited about that. I know gene therapy is not in favor right now. I think partly because the first generation of gene therapy just didn't fully understand the whole notion of cross correction, right? And I think now there is some emerging technologies that will help with cross correction, and hopefully those will essentially be able to survive the class sentiment, right? And show that when you have a good drug, despite when there's a bad class sentiment, good drugs still ultimately win. And I think some of the emerging oncology modalities, where things could be very specialized to individual patients, I think that is beginning to come into bear, right? So there's still horrible situations out there in oncology, especially with the solid tumors or neuroendocrine carcinomas and tumors. Right. And I think there are technologies that are going to be coming that will finally help us address solid tumors and some of those terrible untreated diseases.
Yeah. You had mentioned that you'd started working on Alzheimer's in the 80s. I've heard many times on this show that it feels like we're kind of going through a neuroscience renaissance now. And your career kind of like working through the industry. Why do you think this is happening today? Like what's kind of led to the culmination of activity, excitement?
Oh, I think that's actually all thanks to Biogen, Lilly, and so forth, because I think they now have set the path, if you will, for new Alzheimer's approvals. Right, the FDA has approved these drugs. It's shown that there's a path to approval for these drugs, right? And if you can get a drug for Alzheimer's out there, some of the others one are less daunting. And I think that's why there's been more focus on CNS, right? And coupled with some of the things I've just mentioned earlier, which about BBB crossing technologies that allows you to get things into the brain. Now, if you have a regulatory pathway to get things approved, I think there will be more interest.
Certainly. So maybe kind of bookend this conversation. We started with your career. You've kind of seen the scale of these large public companies. You've been in the trenches on biotech. Where have you had the most fun in your career?
This is where I'm schizophrenic, right? the beauty about being in a small company is you can get things done quickly. Right? And this is where you could get science done quickly. This is where you can execute things quickly and so forth. Right. So that's a lot of fun. Right? But being in a large company where you have lots of resources, right? You don't have to worry about the pennies, right? Or where the next penny is going to come from. You just deploy the resources to get things done too. Right. So you can get things done. I mean, when it comes to executing a large clinical trial, I would want a big pharma company to do that any day of the week, right? Because as a small company, we're just having to essentially, right now, we're delaying a clinical trial just because we can't raise the funding, right? So resources, it's a lot of fun when you have resources, but it's a lot of fun when you have the ability to move quickly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a little bit of grass is a little bit greener on each side,
Yeah.
depending on how you're cutting it.
Yeah.
Maybe my final question for you is, what do you not get asked enough that you should be asked more?
Believe it or not, I don't think I get asked the question of what does success look like enough. In pharma and biotech, everybody's worried about the downside, right? Everybody's worried about the downside. We don't pay enough attention to how the world could be different if we're successful. Imagine a world whereby if you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's not a life sentence anymore, right? Right now, it is a life sentence and it steals somebody's memory. My dad's memory is going, right? And that's what drives me. Imagine in Parkinson's, when you get diagnosed, it doesn't necessarily mean a one-way road to losing your muscle control, right? And that is what really drives me. And that's the world that I'm trying to make happen. Right? So what does success look like when we achieve what we're hoping to do?
Yeah, inspiring. Well, Cuong, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join me on this show. I've so enjoyed this conversation.
Brandon, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a lot of fun conversation.
This has been a ton of fun.